Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. You've made it to the last morning of our conference. That's very impressive. We're delighted to share some time with you. Colleagues who are coming into the room, please come and grab a seat. And welcome to this session, The Road to COP16 and COP19. How can investors accelerate action on climate and biodiversity? My name is Nathan Fabian, and I'm the Chief Sustainable Systems Officer at the PRI. I'm going to introduce my panel and colleagues to you. First, we have Layali Ramahi, who's UNEP Regional Lead for North America. And whereas I am the Climate COP29 person, Layali will be the COP16 biodiversity person on this panel to give you some background, and then our colleagues will discuss the areas together. And so we're joined by Amy De Eugenio, Sustainability Director at Federated Hermes Limited, Kyung Ah Park, Head of ESG Investment Management and Managing Director of Sustainability at Temasek, and James Alexander, who is, of course, the GSIA Chair. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to share with you some details, if you like, some context on what's happening around these COPs and start to link together the ideas for you. And what we hope is that we'll see an acceleration of both ambition and implementation of both global climate and nature agendas. And of course, the two agreements that we're talking about here are the UNFCCC and the CBD, or the Convention on Biological Diversity. So in this session, we're going to consider the role that investors play. And hopefully, if we have a good discussion, you'll start to understand a little bit more about how investors are working with policymakers on these big global agreements. And if this is somewhat new to you, get a better sense of how you can contribute or participate in this policy work, which we know is growing in importance. Now, our belief is that it takes investors demonstrating their own credible action, and that it takes engagement with policymakers on what we need policymakers to do. Both of these are the key ingredients. And if we do this well, we have the chance that governments will commit to increased action and implementation, and this in turn can give us confidence as investors. And so this is the virtuous circle, if you like, that we're trying to build. Now, this audience, by the third morning of a sustainability conference, will have heard about climate change many times. So I'm not going to tell you the context. You know it already. We also know that time is short. Why don't we focus on what we expect to be the arc of activity and change through COP29 and COP30? So in the climate COPs, we think that NDC enhancement, or nationally determined contributions, will be a key issue. We think that the increasing connection between climate and nature will be important, and this is going to be driven in large part by the Brazil COP, where the Brazilian government will take great effort to bring these two ideas together in next year in 2025. There'll be a focus on implementation of commitments, and we hope there'll be clearer investment signals and accelerating financial flows. And I'm just going to introduce this slightly thorny issue on carbon markets and offsets, which we know is a key issue in transition plans, and one of the really difficult questions I think we're still trying to resolve in some of the transition planning globally. So first on COP29, which is being dubbed the Climate Finance COP. Those of you who've been around this game for a while might have heard those words before, but I think there is a fairly high expectation that finance is meant to unlock some of the negotiations this year. And what's driving this is what is hoped to be a new finance goal to replace the $100 billion finance target, and it's under the auspices of something called the New Collective and Quantified Goal. We need more acronyms. This is the NCQG. Now, what this actually looks like in practice, we don't know. I'm going to share some insights that we have, but there's still a lot of uncertainty, and it's quite a difficult target to land, both in terms of the quantum, which countries are committed, who might be the beneficiaries, the role of public and private finance. Now, the Paris Agreement makes it clear that we must increase finance flows if we're going to have any chance of meeting the climate objectives. So our community, what we do as responsible investors and finance, is part of the agreement between nations. And so we're going through this phase of incremental clarification of what that means, of what our role is. We always love it when the politicians get together to discuss that, of course. All right, it may seem like a very political process, this negotiation, and it's more traditionally situated in the negotiation between countries on public flows. But the truth is, the governments know, we know, it's going to take private finance alongside public finance. And that's what makes this conversation so interesting. We also know that there's a very strong emerging market focus, both from a global negotiation perspective on climate ambition, but also in terms of sustainable development and who pays for that, where the investment is coming from. So I'm told that there are at least a couple of visions of what this new collective and quantified goal could look like. But there is a proposal that it is a goal to mobilize $1 trillion a year to developing countries. Accountability for raising that money would probably be linked only to if finance is provided. It doesn't look like it's going to be an explicit commitment of either public or private actors to reaching that $1 trillion figure. But let's see how that goes. The proposal's interesting, and without getting into too much detail, the view is that there should be an outer layer, if you can visualize, of a global investment target with a core target in the middle that should support it, largely with the public finance in the middle and then the private and co-financing in the broader, the outside target. And that trillion is the outside number. Now, obviously, there's going to be some need for discussion on the policies required to bring that private finance in. And so the need for dialogue between policymakers and investors is much higher now if this is the vision, if there's going to be a global financing target that includes private finance. And so our role in this conversation seems to be more critical than ever. NDC enhancement, let's focus on that briefly. So I think everyone knows, hopefully, that there are new commitments required or needed by February. In truth, they'll trickle in for the months after in the lead up to COP30. So the countries should be making new commitments. And this time, there should be some 2035 targets. So this is the idea of adding some precision and clarity on the transition pathways to net zero 2050. And so 2035 targets by countries would start to make quite a difference to the transition planning of sectors that we invest in. And of course, there must be an attempt to close what is still a policy ambition and delivery gap. And NDCs don't only have targets, they also have a range of commitments at sectoral and commitment level, policy level within countries. And so we'll see how these develop. I think the interesting thing about the NDCs this time is that they're meant to be investable. So there we are again, getting some clarity on the role of the financial sector. And this is something we'll explore a lot in this panel today. What does it mean to be investable? Well, we've got some ideas. We think that the NDCs should have clear information for investors and companies about where national governments will seek to allocate capital, which sectors, which regions, for what type of transition paths. We think there should be sectoral decarbonisation roadmaps with credible milestones and timelines, because this strengthens investor confidence. It gives us a sense that governments are going to lock in behind their own targets if they're starting to adopt these as a whole of government approach. And preferably, some clarity on specifying the role of public and private finance so that we know where the incentives, where the policy requirements are going to come from that will attract and encourage us to allocate capital. So this idea of investability will be really important. The truth is, different countries are at different levels of readiness for this. Not a surprise. But if there's something we can be doing, is providing feedback to our governments on what investable NDCs look like. So COP28 last year saw an unprecedented global commitment to transition away from fossil fuels. It didn't quite get where we needed to, but, and as Anne said yesterday, Anne Simpson, it took us 28, but finally fossil fuels are coming into the discussions, which is good in this precise way. But also to triple renewable energy, double energy efficiency, tackle deforestation. These are all issues that demonstrate an increased ambition and should be coming through the global stocktake. And so COP29 will be asking, well, how much progress are we making on these new commitments, these new goals? And so we should be expecting to see some advance on this. The IEA recently produced some analysis that looked at the implementation of the goals to triple renewable energy and double energy efficiency. It shows that implementing the tripling renewables goals of the UAE consensus would cut emissions by 10 billion tonnes by 2030 compared to what was expected before that agreement. So this is substantial, 10 billion tonnes annually by 2030. And so if there's a strong concerted effort to back that up through the NDCs, it's a big nudge to be heading in the right direction. Just quickly on Article 6 and carbon markets. So discussions are continuing on the rules for Article 6 of the Paris Agreement related to carbon markets, which were first agreed in Glasgow. Article 6 sets the rules for global trade in greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And under Article 6.2, countries can adopt to allow cross-border exchanges of credits. Sorry for the legal articles, but it's something we're going to be dealing with. Article 6.4 specifically allows a company in one country to reduce emissions domestically and have those reductions credited so it can sell them to another company in another country. So this sounds like the type of thing we've been asking for on carbon markets, but of course it introduces a bunch of integrity issues and carbon market function issues. And so how we collectively work on this area in a way that provides confidence to investors is a critical issue. Because there are concerns about greenwashing. There are concerns about which countries have the natural assets that can support these markets and which ones do not. And so there's still some way to go on these rules. Our observation is that this is quite an important area for investors, and it's one specific piece that we should be leaning into. Now, very quickly, I'm going to share some things that the PRI is doing to support investors, and then we'll cover our biodiversity COP. So you might be aware that the net zero initiatives, specifically the NZ-AOA, celebrated its 5-year anniversary. Everyone involved in the AOA is very proud of it, and that's because they're really trying to do serious work there and to make ambitious commitments and follow them through as best possible. So we do need to support and recognise the work of this community. And if you haven't followed it yet, please do have a look. But the 5-year anniversary of that group was a very welcome milestone. Also, there is the 2024 Global Investor Statement to Government on Climate Change. Already we have over 500 financial institutions of around 30 trillion. And if you want to, you can still sign it. It would be helpful to have the number of supporters higher. So the Global Investor Statement to Government on Climate Change is something you can sign up to, and that's still open. We also have collaborative sovereign engagement on climate change that the PRI supports. We've talked about it at this event. And there is also the Task Force on Net Zero Policy. And so that's supporting the Secretary General and the UN system to understand just how fast the policy change is going. And we're going to announce the progress that's been made on net zero policy at COP29. So there's just a few things you can monitor and participate in, and we're going to discuss more through this panel. I'd now like to pass over to Leolie, and thanks for bearing with us on this Thursday morning. We're now going to give you the context on the Biodiversity COP. Over to you.
Thank you, Nathan. And I think it was great that you set the stage for the Paris moment. And I think it's great to be back in Canada for the 2 years after the Paris moment for nature and the adoption of the the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and which the overarching aim is to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030. So as we head on from Montreal and now to Cali for COP16, it will be a critical moment for us to assess the progress so far and reinforce that the financial sector is mainly at the heart of the negotiations as well, similar to the climate finance COP. The same will be in terms of looking at the nature COP, in terms of assessing the progress, but also the role of the financial sector that is playing at COP. So to understand where the finance sector negotiations are going to be involved at COP16, it is good to get a snapshot of where we are right now. And according to the latest assessment in terms of the state of finance for nature, if we look, there is nearly 7 trillion in invested globally each year in activities that directly negatively impact nature. And to double click on that, the private sector responsible for 5 trillion annually of that, opposed to only contributing to 35 billion in terms of finance. So that's over 140 billion in gaps between the negative finance and the positive finance on nature. And there's a huge potential for bridging that finance gap and the 200 billion target of the GBF framework. And financing by 2050 needs to at least quadruple from the current rates. So to complement that, Unify and in collaboration with our partners, PRI, are looking at what is the trend beyond nature-based solutions that the report stated, and what are we seeing in terms of the financial assets and where they are going. Of course, I'm sure you are very much aware, fixed income in terms of products and assets has been and still continues to grow. We've seen a rise in interest in debt to nature swaps, and especially from governments. And we are seeing rise in growth in terms of private equity and VC investments in nature positive solutions, which is very promising. But I want to also highlight a very important trend that we are seeing, which is very important to shed light on, and how we're seeing the market changing very quickly, which is in particular looking at the climate nature nexus, and in particular when it comes to the agriculture sector or ocean finance, which are bridging both of the agendas together. And there's a lot of growth in terms of that assessment and understanding, but also looking at, in particular, indigenous-led conservation. It's very important to note that trend, in particular, the change in terms of the finance industry of not looking at indigenous peoples and local populations just as beneficiaries or as involved in the process, but rather as leaders and hosts of nature and the progress moving forward. So that went back. There we go. So, what did we hear in terms of common trends and the state of gap for financing nature, and how does that lend to the conversations by member states at the broader level? We can see that the gap that investors and the broader community kept on saying is that there's a lack of understanding in the views beyond the financial community, in consistent definitions and having a standard barrier to, and which plays as a significant barrier towards financing nature positive outcome. And that's why, in leading to the conversations from a broader different stakeholders and to member states to identify how the finance community can participate, in collaboration with the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation, we put out a concept paper for a finance for nature positive model. And it's very important to lend itself to the conversations on bridging that finance gap by countries, which is the core of the conversations across the negotiations for COP16. So what are we saying? And in a very quick, very structure, the aim is to consult and get that feedback on that concept paper, and to offer that guidance for financial institutions that want to align with a nature positive global goal, with the global biodiversity framework, but also what actions can they take on now and what can they put together moving forward. Now, this is not to scare you, but to wake you up for the conversation today and get you excited about checking out and giving feedback for the framework. But mainly, it aligns to the global standards, and in particular, definitions developed by the World Bank Group. And very importantly, for us to, in this thinking, think of how can we bridge, in particular for nature as an important asset, public and private finance views, as de-risking is very important and shared capital is very important for nature. So we very much advise you to take a look at the framework and see how it lends itself to the negotiation, and understanding where we are on nature as a complex issue, and we understand that topic. So basically, what do we expect from COP16, and where are the negotiations currently? So in the lead up to COP16, a significant topic of negotiations across the parties is private sector contribution to the mobilization of the targets of financing nature and biodiversity. And specifically, you'll be here at reference to as D3 of the monitoring framework of the Kunming-Montreal. And mainly, there are very different conversations that are related to the private sector and private finance across the negotiations. But within the GBF, there are specific and several targets that are related to the finance and private sector, from the 4 overarching goals and across the 23 targets. But it's crucial to indicate that there is significant interest and drive from the parties in the negotiations to understand what is the financing need for nature and biodiversity. So one of the main themes that are coming across are the statements from member states, in particular when it comes to matching the synergy in climate and nature finance. Also, not just at the investment level, but at a country level, they're looking at the synergy in terms of how can we cover both in terms of allocating financing needed for biodiversity in particular. The other issue, which is very important, is what is the state of implementation so far? Countries have adopted 2 years ago the GBF, and there was a commitment to update their national biodiversity strategy and action plans to include and map out to the targets of the GBF framework. And also, there was a very important commitment in terms of assessing the preparedness for preparing national biodiversity finance plans, which is very much important and direct to allocating finance and speaking to the private sector in terms of where that finance needs to go. So, where are we in the preparedness? And a very good note in terms of the updates on the biodiversity plans. There were, based on the 63 countries that have already submitted their national plans, there are over 17,000 targets to map. And you can imagine how heavy that would be for the financial sector. And a lot of them, they have provided specific information to D3 and D3 in terms of finance, but there isn't specific metrics or targets or plans by countries that you can say it's very clearly done in terms of how finance will be allocated to financing nature. But a very important part that I should highlight for the financial sector is regarding Target 15. Target 15 of the Global Biodiversity Framework is the target that requires financial institutions, the private sector, to assess, disclose risks, impacts, and dependencies on nature. And almost the majority of countries have mapped and included that target in their plans. And that is very important to see how that will move forward in terms of regulations and policy, but there is no clear indication on how that is moving forward. The last last and not least is the Global Biodiversity Framework and the convention is looking at a whole of economy approach and whole of society approach, and how to include non-state actors in the negotiations, in the discussions, but also in particular for the financial sector. So how are we looking at that, and what are the policy frameworks that are available to accelerate finance is what we'll be looking for COP16, and we will follow the negotiations. And with that, I'll give it to Nathan.
Thanks, Layli. It is interesting, isn't it, to hear when Layli describes some of the national commitments under these global agreements. Sometimes when we're working with our financial regulators and policymakers and we're working on disclosure issues or new policies, sometimes we don't realize actually they've had an origin in a global negotiation that's been agreed, and actually we're just seeing the implementation part. So this is the system working. It's quite easy to be a bit discouraged, I think, by some of the international frameworks, but Layli's calling out things that we've already seen taken up nationally in COPs, nationally in financial regulation after climate COPs. So this machinery does have an important role and is starting to work. And I guess the question is, how do we make it work better for us? So, all right, I'm going to ask an open question to our colleagues to start, and just chime in as you wish, and we'll build the conversation. So what do you see as the key issues at stake for the forthcoming COPs? And as investors or representing investor groups, what are the key priorities do you have? James, go for it.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, and thank you for those overviews. It's really great to see how much is going on, how much is happening. So I'm James Alexander. I'm chair of the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance. So we're the network of all the CIFs from around the world. So CIFs across Europe, the US, Canada, Australasia, Japan, and my own CIF, which is UKSIF. And we work closely as part of the ecosystem. We've been doing a lot of work together with PRI, looking at how we all form part of this broader ecosystem. And our strong view is that we achieve more when we work collaboratively. COP26, many of you would have been there in Glasgow, felt like a high watermark for the engagement of investors, corporates, and the COP process, the UN process, whether that's the biodiversity or the climate process. And what happened that COP26 governments came along and made new commitments, but also we saw the private sector and the investors making commitments too. And that's because we felt the public saw climate as a top priority issue at the time. Business realized that this was a core direction of travel, and governments were fully committed and behind it. If you like, the inevitable policy response that PRI has been talking about for a long time, it's a great concept. It felt like it was arriving. It felt the inevitability was here. And so, of course, GFANZ was created. There's now 150 trillion of global AUM committed under GFANZ. But I think the challenge is, it felt like policymakers in particular thought, well, that's it, problem solved. The corporates are on board, the finance is flowing, job done. And of course, it didn't mean that. And the world moved its attention away from being focused on climate to focus on the conflict in Ukraine at that time. I think we struggled with a number of different issues. The assets and projects available to invest $150 trillion in are not there, they're not forthcoming. Government momentum seemed to stall a little bit around taking action around climate and nature. And there was this kind of recognition from the private sector, the investor side, that you need government policy to actually drive activity and allow us the activities to invest in the things to move forwards on. And so I think that's one of the core messages that we're taking to COP29, and it's a new report that we're going to be publishing. I'm very happy to kind of preview some of it today. It's called Transforming Global Finance for Climate Action. And the analysis that we've made, is that policymakers' expectations on private capital, or have placed expectations on private capital without fully understanding how investment decisions are made. And at the same time, as capital providers, as the investment community, we've responded with inflated promises and made commitments ourselves that are not being realized, partly because they're based on government commitments and priorities that themselves haven't been materialized. And so we've got an impasse. There's a policymaker-investor dilemma that we think about. And that's kind of at the heart of the incentive issue. And the incentive challenge that we see there's a whole set of misalignments of incentives. And it feels like there's a challenge where rational investors are still somehow incentivized to invest in unsustainable things. And you mentioned it yourself, $7 trillion, was it $7 trillion? Yeah, $7 trillion invested annually in activities that harm nature. You know, there's something going really, really wrong when we've spent all these decades having climate negotiations, biodiversity negotiations, and we're still investing and incentivized to invest so much capital in activities that are causing such harm. And so we've come up with a framework, we call it the acronym PIVOT, that we're going to be presenting, and it's really talking to policymakers about the things they need to do to work with us to help us be incentivized to invest in the right thing. So the P of PIVOT is for policy vacuum. Policies are currently creating barriers to action rather than advancing it. We're not seeing the carbon taxes across the economy. We're not seeing the positive policies moving forwards. In fact, we're still seeing incentives like fossil fuel subsidies that are encouraging us to act in the wrong direction. Interest, self-interest. We're focusing on quick wins and near-term returns, not thinking about the longer term, which of course climate and biodiversity challenges are the epitome of long-term challenges. Valuation, or indeed, as you might say, misvaluation. Financial models don't account for environmental and social factors. We're looking at short-term valuations. We're looking at the fact that the Amazon rainforest is worth more when it's cut down than when it's standing up. How have we got into this situation? The final two parts of our pivot framework is ownership or inactive ownership. We're not being as actively involved in owning our assets. And finally, transition misalignment. We're not meeting the goals of the transition because we're not focusing on them, and the models that we're using, the business models that we're using, are still not aligned to transitioning. So I'll leave it there for now, but that's the analysis that we've got, and we've got some positives
that we need to fix up. So I've got to ask the question, do you think that these processes are going to give us a chance to make some advance on those, or do you think that there's not even the awareness?
So I think the challenge is fixable, and it relies upon two things. Us as investors working out more about how policymakers are doing their job and engaging more actively with policymakers. One of the challenges post-COP26, when I said lots of investors came, haven't been going to these things in the sort of large numbers that we did then. We haven't been reiterating our commitments. We haven't been reiterating how much we can do and how much we want to do. But at the same time, the other end, policymakers need to understand how capital flows work and how investors work and what makes and drives investment decisions, and need to start thinking about what they can do that will reset these alignment challenges. Mark Carney talked yesterday really interestingly about the heavy industries and how heavy industries transition. Imagine you're the chief exec of a large concrete company or something. You might be passionately committed to net zero, but you're going to struggle to raise the capital or raise the investment to invest in your company when there's no green premium on green concrete at the moment, and there's also no regulatory or policy incentive or requirement for you to make it greener. So Mark Carney talked about some of the ways that that's happening and changing in the auto industry. We need to think about those models and regulations across all sorts of hard-to-abate industries.
Okay, very good. Some nice specific examples. Just before we bring Kyung-Ah in, if I asked you to raise a hand, if you would you consider it, please? If you feel like you're doing something, either demonstrating progress or contributing an ask or an expectation of governments for either of these upcoming COPs. So do you know your organisation's doing something? Put your hand up if your organisation's doing something to demonstrate your progress or to make a significant ask, make an ask. So I'd say we've got around about 10% of the audience. Okay, for the shy 90%. Do you think you would like to take something away from this session that could allow you to do that better? Put up your hand. Okay, good. So we're up, there's another 20%. So with a third of the audience is doing or wants to take away something from this session on what they can do. And I'm going to ask you a question in a moment on the Slido poll, what you would like to see. I'm not asking it yet, just so you can think. What would you like to see to take away from the next round of commitments by governments at these COPs? So just have a think about that. Now, Kyung-Ah, when we were setting up the session, she said, I'm an investor. Don't ask me about policy agreements. I want to know what I can invest in. What does it mean? So Kyung-Ah, over to you.
I will talk about policy though. And I think what you said resonates in that the holy grail is if you can optimize the pricing signal in terms of obviously putting a carbon price or incentives to the benefit of nature positive outcomes versus the perverse subsidies that we have. And it just so happens to be 7 trillion direct and indirect is going in towards actually perverse subsidies for carbon. And I saw some numbers around ag and other subsidies as well in the context of nature, which we could potentially reorient towards regenerative ag. But with that as sort of an overall, I guess, policy component of it. So for those of you who don't know us, we are a Singapore-anchored global investor with portfolio value about $290 billion US. And we are permanent capital, and our purpose is so every generation prospers. So we invest today with certainly the current generation, but the future generation in mind. And so sustainability is the core of everything we do. And so for us, when we think about this agenda, we have to think about both the long term, but obviously we also have to think through what the near and medium term return profiles are as well. And so that keeps us very disciplined. And the way we think about this, which I'll come back to in terms of the opportunity as well as the how do you think about some of the challenges, is this is a whole economy transformation. And we've got to do it at an unprecedented scale as well as unprecedented time frame. And so we've got to harness every single lever that we can. And so the way we're leaning in is one, we're deploying capital towards what we call sustainable living trends, which is very much transcending the volatility of the market. We think of it as a durable opportunity that really transcends both market sectors and time horizons. And we're investing into that across certainly climate technologies, those that are already scale and proven, and I want to come back to that point. But also innovative climate solutions that we need for hard-to-abate sectors, which is incredibly hard work because we now know that the cost of capital is very different than even a few years ago when arguably it was pretty much free in many places. And now that's very much changed. And as you said, there are a lot of headwinds that are taking mindshare away from doing some of the hard work. And I've heard across different panels and sessions the tyranny of the buckets. And as owners, we've got to figure out how to overcome that because the tyranny of the buckets is not doing us service. Because when you think about innovative solutions, that may be proven at the technology level, and you need to take it from first of a kind to nth of a kind and rapidly scale it and bring it down the cost curve, there's got to be different forms of capital that crowds in and goes from that early stage, the growth stage, all the way and make it infrastructure-esque, and we need that fungibility of capital, right? We also need policy, because ultimately many of these are more costly. And so well-designed policy can get you a long way there, and obviously IRA is a prime example of that, but there are many examples of good policy levers that are actually working, but we need that to bring down the green premium. I want to double click on proven technology already scaled like renewable energy, because people think that renewable energy is getting deployed relatively easily, but you got to work it in a systems manner together with storage, grid and permitting issues, which is a challenge already in developed economies because some of the choicest places have already been connected and renewable energy is already there. But when you take it to emerging and developing economies, it's even harder. And we have a lot of neighbors in our region that has a lot of potential for renewable energy, but deployment is still quite challenging. And if you think about Asia, and to borrow some of the words that I've heard in the past about Asia being the place where the war on climate will be won or lost, as well as on nature, by the way, because the economy in Asia is more than 50% dependent on nature. And it also has significant natural resources and forests, right? And so when you think about emerging and developing economies in Asia, the energy profile is such that I think something like over 900 million people still lack access to reliable and affordable energy. Energy demand is growing more than twice, right? So you got to figure out how to actually meet that demand with renewable and clean energy first and foremost. But investors say they want to deploy more capital there. But when you have, whatever it is, $10 billion of portfolio that you can allocate, it's a lot easier to put it into developed economies that you're familiar with, where there's stable policy environments, than try to learn how to actually deploy capital into EMDEs. And some of them are riskier, but some of them are actually not that risky, but there's a perceived risk perception, and it requires a lot of hard work, elbow grease, return on your efforts. So how do we make it easy for investors to deploy capital into EMDEs? And I'm not going to go into too much detail in there, but one of the things that we should talk about is the catalytic component of the concessional capital, the finite public sector capital or philanthropic capital, and the unlocks that you can do to de-risk and mobilize more capital for mainstream investors to go into EMDEs and do renewable energy type opportunities. And we set up a platform company called Pentagreen to try to do some of the hard work to take marginally bankable sustainable infrastructure in Southeast Asia and actually try to get it to scale by taking, it's not technically concessional other than the fact that we have to do a lot of the hard work, but it's taking mezzanine, the lowest capital tier debt, and also taking some construction risk that a lot of financiers are not willing to take and crowding in mainstream financing. The one last thing I'll mention, because you mentioned it, and it very much relates to nature, is carbon markets. We absolutely need carbon markets. And we need it through the Articles 6.2 and 6.4, but we also need voluntary carbon markets. If carbon value is, the time value of carbon is of the essence, which it is, right? We cannot wait until 2050 and say, oops, we couldn't get there now, let's figure out how to use carbon offsets. We know that we got to do the integrity, we got to have all the bells and whistles, but we got to learn from our mistakes and figure out how to actually work within the system and get it going, rather than saying we want everything perfect and therefore we can't do it and therefore let's wait. And we're seeing quite a lot of opportunities around nature-based solutions, as well as carbon to be able to bring down the green premium. And by the way, I forgot to mention, we've got to phase down fossil-based energy and phase it out eventually. And to actually phase out coal in Asia, because it's a very, very young fleet, less than 15 years old, transition credits can play a very, very meaningful role in actually bringing down that economics and providing the right incentives, as well as for nature-based solutions, which, by the way, it's not just about nature as well as carbon. It's also about resilience and adaptation as well. Things like mangrove protection, coastal protection, erosion protection, as well as community benefits. You get the multi-factor co-benefits. And so we all have to do the hard work in thinking through, how do we take an interconnected approach to this? How do we think about a systems approach to this? And how do we actually make sure that we create different opportunity sets that go from a project level to a platform level to an asset class that enables mainstream investors to come in at a scale.
That point you made on carbon markets is interesting. So let's say that's an area of specific reform we want progress on.
Yep.
Is there anything you would take as a single signal from a COP, or would you wait for other signals that
Signals from COP for carbon markets.
carbon markets? Yeah, if
We're already investing into carbon markets. So we have a platform, a dedicated platform called Gen Zero that we stood up and seeded with 5 billion Sing dollars that is basically dedicated towards this, where they're investing into nature-based solutions, a few limited technologies in hard-to-abate sectors like sustainable aviation fuel, where the monetization of the carbon credit, SAF-C, through a book and claim system can actually bring down the green premium and get it going at scale and the market ecosystem around it. We're not waiting.
Yeah, great.
Because if you wait, it's going to be too late. And we believe that you can actually make money in the process, but it takes time.
Fantastic. That's the demonstrating part. That's excellent. All right, so before we bring Amy in, let's put a question then. So you've heard our experts, our colleagues, talk a bit about the things that they care about and they're working on. If we can have the first Slido question, please. So you can go on and vote. It is, what would your organisation like to see from the next round of NDCs and national biodiversity plans to accelerate investment? So we know we need something on carbon markets that we've just discussed here. We know that we need to respond to the pivot challenges, which is a good start. If we can have the voting up on the screen, there's the question. Thank you. This is one of those word cloud ones, so you can probably upvote if you want, or copy, once we get some answers coming through. All right, so once that data comes up, we'll respond to it. Here we go, we're going. This is a long list, people. Wow, okay. US should ratify. That's a good one. Ambition. Right, I assume to people that means deeper cut commitments. Is that right? Deeper targets. So 2035 targets on climate. And then what kind of targets are we expecting on these national biodiversity plans?
Aside from seeing the integration of Target 15, we are expecting a bit more details on finance in particular and towards a target of 200 billion.
Yep.
But on the US ratify the GBF, unfortunately, the US is not a signatory to the CBD, but they are very closely engaged with the discussions more broadly. So they will not be able to ratify the global biodiversity framework without being party to the convention.
Okay, good. If our colleagues who are running this are happy to leave that up for a minute or two, would be helpful, because I just want to use some of it in the next question, if that's okay. So, Amy, let's go to you. Let's just change tack a little bit. What's it like being at one of these COPs when you're there? What's the atmosphere? What's the experience? What should people be prepared for if they're going to go to one of them?
Yeah, thank you. So perhaps we were in Canada, so I might talk about the biodiversity COP. So COP 15 a couple of years ago in December, and they had a lot of rooms like this, actually, absolutely huge airport hangars. And this is where what they were really trying to do is get the agreement signed. And it was quite an exciting time, I think, because there was this one goal of trying to get an agreement, and it wasn't a foregone conclusion in any way. There were walkouts, there were all sorts of challenges. And for those of you that haven't been before, I think just to try and paint the picture, you would have all of these types of big rooms, and you would have the 200 or so countries around a horseshoe-style table, and a moderator at the front, and these huge screens, and you would have the agreement, and it was being live agreed at the time. And it took absolutely ages, but so it should, because you're trying to get an agreement.
They're going line by line on the screen.
Line by line. And I cannot tell you the amount of time it took to agree a comma, because it meant something different for every country. And it was a really, really big deal. but it took a lot of time. And for me, I think what was interesting is I found it quite a two-speed COP, in the sense that you would have sort of, all these negotiations, they're going on very long. I don't know if that was tactics to kind of wear people down, I'm not sure, but was going late into the night, and there's no food at the COPs as well. So when you're going, take your own food and your own snacks. But so you had that going on, and then also there was introduced, like we were talking earlier, where you have finance and business coming in, and at COP15, it was the first time that finance and business was there, and they had that day. And the same thing will happen at COP16 on October the 28th. And that was almost like breakneck speed. So the amount of conversations that were going on with TNFD, getting all the sectors together, people meeting, creating new meetings, all these frameworks coming up, guidebooks. There was just so much activity. And so I think it was quite exciting to have the voice of finance there, as we've been discussing today. I think there's going to be more of that voice of finance at COP16. And I think what's going to be interesting about the next one is that we had this goal and we got the agreement. And you saw that picture that Layli put up before. It was really exciting. And you saw the masks as well, as sort of right in that end of COVID. And it was 14,500 people there, and it was a big deal. Now it's all about putting it into implementation. So I saw that ambition is sort of like one of the biggest, most common points here. We want to see the ambition turn into action, and that's actually the thing that we really want to see at COP16 with the NDCs.
Okay, thank you. Now, if you don't mind me saying, your job is to do, one of your jobs is to do policy engagement. So when you're doing your job as a policy engager on behalf of investors, what do you do?
Yeah, so we have, Amy DeGenio, I'm a sustainability director at Federated Hermes Limited, and I sit in the responsibility office, and a lot of the work that I do is with the stewardship team, the EOS team. And we engage with companies a lot on ESG issues that pertain to long-term sustainability. But what we also do is maybe 10 or 15% of the time through that and the policy group within the responsibility office is public policy work. And so particularly in relation to biodiversity, for example, we're part of the Finance for Biodiversity group. And Sonia Lichtman, who's one of my colleagues, is terrific. She's in London at the moment. She'll be in Cali, Colombia. She's the co-chair of the Finance for Biodiversity Public Policy and Action Group. And so really what her role has been is to provide the financial voice in these negotiations. And her and many others as part of this group put out a framework and some recommendations to engage the policymakers around how to put in place their NDCs for COP16. So I think it was 63 that you said, Layli, so there's quite a few more to go. We'll see what happens in a few weeks. They should all be submitted by then. But so she and the team have put together some recommendations. So it's around mandatory disclosure on impacts, dependencies, opportunities and risks. It's also looking at sectoral transition plans as well. So we really need collaboration to solve a lot of these problems. Other things are just getting action from central banks and their supervisors. And then finally, it's this topic that's really running through all of our conversations, which is the alignment of financial flows. How are you dealing with subsidies? We need to get the balance sheet right before anything is going to change.
Okay, thank you for that work. It's very important. And I know James does some of that work, and of course the PRI supports as well. But this is the type of thing we're going to need to be doing more in tangible ways. All right, so thank you to the colleagues for putting that question up. Can we bring up the next poll question for the audience? This is a how question. It's how can investors accelerate policy action on the delivery of the climate and nature goals? Hopefully it's available to you on Slido now. You just had some hints from Amy. Excellent. Very good. And just a reminder, you can post questions anytime you like, and we'll have the time today to bring them into the discussion. So if you ask a good one, it's likely we're going to use it. All right, so we were talking about in practical terms about what to do. So the easiest thing to do is sign the statement. And I see our series colleagues and some of our other colleagues in the audience who have been putting this statement together. What is it now? 12 years we've been doing this statement, maybe maybe more. So it'd be great to get a bigger number this year. So that's one easy thing that you can do. You can also participate in different collaborative policy groups that all the investor associations have, like go to a meeting, hear what the agenda is. If you want to go to a COP, you can. If you want to go to Baku, good, you're brave. Some of us will be there. And of course, Brazil next year will probably be very big on COP, on climate COP. So if you want to participate in these forums, there's usually investor delegations that are supported by our various investor associations. And of course, now we've got professional services. We've got paid, capable people who can support you with policy engagement. And of course, there are many expert groups that governments run now to do detailed policy design work. And our community is very active in that, and it's actually a very good space to engage government on their plans. So there's 5 things you can do in order to pursue some of the aims you put on this slide. Alrighty, would it be helpful, Laeli, I'm just wondering, with the biodiversity COP and ambition on nature, can you just give us a couple of minutes on the difference between nature loss, protection, and nature positive? I think you've used some of these terms, but just help everyone understand what's at stake and what the expectations on the private sector. Is that okay? We didn't script any of this,
Yes.
but are you willing?
We did. I'm willing, but yes, absolutely. And I think it lends very well to when I read the word collaboration, because for nature in particular, you can't address it at a single institution without collaborative efforts. So, and I think it lends to itself in terms of what we talked about, the mitigation framework from a broader perspective. So what are the expectations for the GBF, at least from a 2020 baseline? Halt nature and biodiversity loss by 2030. That's the first goal of the GBF, and reverse it to restoration by 2050. So that's the overarching in terms of the targets that we need to apply. But how do we think about it in terms of the capital allocation and what we presented as a model, and what is the mitigation hierarchy, which is based on the World Bank? First is assessing, think about it in terms of checking your assets, in terms of review, in terms of alignment, mapping your assets, where are the risks, and in terms of the mitigation approach as the first tier, first layer, looking at it from a compliance perspective. Then moving to what is nature finance. And nature finance, we defined it from 2 different perspectives in terms of the first broader, in terms of the economic transformation. What are the investments in nature that are part of the economic transformation process? As we talked about, agriculture sector, other forestry sectors, those are the transformation broader sector. And then when you tag it further to nature positive, what are the KPIs in particular that you're delivering on restoration and added value to nature? So I think progressively when it comes to, and I think to differentiate the urgency by 2030 in terms of halting, the difference that I would say, and not say it as do it, not take it in my words as do it very lightly, but when we say climate, we say we need to cut emissions and then move into buying credits. When it's nature, because we need to reverse, we can't wait to say we halted all negative activities and then we start with the restoration. We can do both, but as long as there's a clear plan. And I think in terms of collaborations, I did mention 7. I did mention the private sectors in terms of 5 trillion negative, but subsidies at 1.7 trillion that are going to sectors that are nature negative. And that's where we need to align it in those negotiations. So I hope that answers you in a very quick level, very
That was good.
approachable.
The follow-up is, of course, you run the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and you also work with insurers at UNFCCC. How clearly are these asks of the economy and investors? How clearly is the engagement of the your finance community coming through on the policy needs? Are we at a stage of sophistication yet where we know what to ask for on these different dimensions of dealing with nature, or have we still got a way to go?
If I would say optimistically, I think there's work underway. Is
Right.
there more to be done? Yes.
Yeah.
Are those sectors, and I'm seeing in particular when it comes to the insurance sector doing on nature positive, especially when it comes to the nature-based solutions and the resilience aspect, which is very important in terms of adaptation for the insurance sector. But I think we have a bit more to go in terms of the asks. And I think in particular banks and insurers are still recovering on the climate side, and a lot of the effort is spent on that. But that doesn't mean that there are no active voices in terms of saying we need to integrate more. I would think that would be a growing trend moving forward.
Yeah, I think it's work for all of us. A lot of investors, if you don't mind me speaking, for our community, say, oh, we've got to take the same path as we took on climate. So let's learn
not
from
do
that.
Yeah.
Actually, there's many more moving parts in nature.
Yes.
We've got less time, and we've got to deal with multiple points of change in natural systems at the same time. So we kind of can't follow the same path. We might learn from the framework, but actually the path's got to be quite different.
Yes.
And so we are going to need to find ways to invest more of our time and effort in this problem, and what we're going to need to do as a community. All right, so let's start to just look forward a little bit. So let's pick up the pivot framework. Have you started to, does that report have some specific things you're hoping for that you will see?
Yeah, so the report includes so it's got separate chapters at the end with sort of advice and guidance for different people doing different roles, and so there's a section on national governments and what we think they should be looking at. There's a section on investors because we're not doing everything perfectly either as a community. There's also a section for COP negotiators with some recommendations and some examples of things that they can incorporate. And I think the word cloud gave some really interesting similarities actually, and you know, on the kind of positive one, the biggest one that came up was ambition. We need to have ambition, but I think we've seen quite a lot of ambition, but it's not been followed up, and that's the problem. So I think I worry that we feel slightly burnt by the ambition when we start, or people generally make decisions based on what they see as the ambition of those around them, only to realize that when the going gets tough, the ambition actually isn't maybe as strong as we thought it was. And so it's got to be followed up by some of the other things that were also on that chart, which were incentives, policy support, and regulation, which, you know, they're the actual solid, politically difficult things, but the things that need to be introduced. And then on the second slide, it was collaborate and engage, and that's one of the core narratives that we're talking to investors about. We obviously in our industry talk about engagement and think that that's stewardship and engagement, engaging with individual assets. Of course, that's absolutely vital and a really key part of our work. But how do we go that level up? How do we start to engage on policy, on a kind of national government level, on an international level? Obviously, PRI is doing a lot of that work, but it's got to also come from the people that are actually allocating capital. You know, getting out there, talking to governments, and saying, if you did this, it would make me allocate capital in the following ways. It would make me change the way I approach things. And you know, you just mentioned there the subsidies, $1.7 trillion of subsidies. That is the ultimate political policy signal of where government wants you. That not only are they saying, here's our ambition, they're also saying, here's our approach to it, and we're putting our money where our mouth is, and we're going in partners with you and investing in the wrong stuff. We have to, you know, and I don't obviously, of course, for a second underestimate the challenge of removing subsidies and the political challenge that brings, and the huge difficulties that comes with and of course that's why we need a just transition. We don't just need a just transition for the challenges that are kind of going to come for the economy. We need a just transition away from subsidies as well, and into a world that doesn't subsidize the wrong things and subsidize in fact the good stuff, and then investors can come in behind that. Final few things on that. So some of the actions for policymakers: getting those national transition plans properly underway, which means, of course, the NDCs and the biodiversity strategies being implemented, and holding each other to account for that, holding governments holding us to account and saying, okay, we've got our national transition plan or biodiversity strategy. How are you looking at that? What are you doing with that? And us going back the other way and saying, yeah, we saw that you've written it down. Let's see how you're delivering it. Let's see what your strategies, timeline, plan, implementation track record are. Looking at the regulatory frameworks and the financial incentives, and looking at ways to drive public and private collaboration as well. We can't get anywhere in those really hard to reach sectors that you were talking about, areas where the market can't reach without the public sector supporting that, driving it, moving along. But again, we can't assume that governments know everything about the challenges we face when it comes to making investment decisions. So we've got to make people aware of where we're seeing struggles. Why can we not invest in particular sectors? What is happening to our investment decisions, whether it's because of policy or technology readiness or other things? So again, opening up that two-way dialogue and making sure that people are aware what the challenges are.
There's a plan, there's an assessment of what needs to be done, and there's a plan. Thank you. That's excellent. So Juan Diego in the audience directs a question for Amy and Kong-Ah. So as you choose, how challenging do you perceive data availability and accuracy on biodiversity impacts at the company level? So let's just delve into the investment question side for a moment. How challenging do you perceive data availability and accuracy on biodiversity impacts? Is that something you could respond to?
I'm happy to start, but I do want to come back on some of the prior conversation.
Go for it.
So we embarked on the climate roadmap and integration first, and just to be transparent, we have a long-term vision and roadmap for net zero, nature positive, and inclusive growth. And in the latter two, we're still early in our journey. But we have been we've done an asset owners pilot across our portfolio to understand where the heat maps are around some of the nature, both dependencies as well as impacts, and started to look at some of the actual available data sets that we can start integrating into our due diligence process. And when you think about even physical climate risk, even though we are more advanced on that than biodiversity, even that, I think, data-wise is actually quite challenging. In particular, asset-level geolocation data is particularly difficult because you have to get that specific data to understand, because it's very location-specific, what are the actual risks? And then you got to do the work in terms of doing the due diligence, engagement, and so forth, right? And so you start taking that across all of your different assets, and then it becomes more challenging, both as it relates to data as well as how do you right-size your own engagement? Because I think that is actually quite critical, given the diversity of, I'm sure for many of you as well, the diversity of our portfolio. Because our intention is to make sure that we drive the right outcomes and not just the outputs. So it's my way of saying, yes, data is challenging, but actually getting the right set of data that drives the right outcomes, I think is really critical. So I guess that's my answer to that. In the context of, I think the word, it keeps coming up, collaboration, and in the word collaboration, I want to underscore a few different types of collaboration. So one is certainly the public and the private sector. We do have to engage and informing the public sector of the unlocks that policy and regulation, can do. And some of them are heavy lifts, but we've got to continue with that because ultimately financial flows go to the most optimized risk return. So how do you optimize that risk return is where policy can play a significant role. When you have that conversation, though, and I was actually quite, somewhat happier, although there was also doom and gloom, coming out of Climate Week, that some of the conversations around climate finance has actually gone down a level, and it's not just at the high level. Right, which is what we need. But I think as practitioners, if we can show some of the actual practical examples to policymakers of what works and what are the unlocks that you can do to scale it, then that becomes actually very practical. And if you can align it with the economic interest and the national interest, that it becomes even more powerful. And I'll give you some examples. We're very blessed to be headquartered in Singapore, anchored in Singapore, because Singapore is a small nation state. There's a lot of opportunity to collaborate with policymakers. And I'll give you a practical example of where, with our Gen Zero platform, the Civil Aviation Authority of Singapore, Neste, and Singapore Airlines, where we're a majority shareholder, we did a 20-month pilot to see how we can actually bring sustainable aviation fuel all the way through the Changi Airport and upload it into the airplane, and then monetize the staff credit in a credible way to bring down some of the green premium. It was small scale, but it gave some level of confidence. We're on the heels of that. Singapore Airlines set a staff target. It's small but pretty meaningful in the context of where we are with staff, where it's a 5% target. And the Singapore government, the Civil Aviation Authority of Singapore, came up with a staff blueprint to say we're going to do bulk procurement of staff by 2030, 3 to 5%, level the playing field. Every single airline that leaves from Changi Airport will have to actually have it. And it will get passed through ticket. And when you pass it through, it's not huge in the context of the actual plane tickets themselves, right? So these are practical ways of how do you inform policy making. Yeah. And hopefully there's more opportunities for us to do this. Same thing, I kind of punted your question around Article 6. Article 6 is hugely important, right? Because ultimately compliance credit is where the teeth is in terms of the demand signal. And the Singapore government has been doing corresponding adjustments, working country by country. And as an example of what the unlocks are, they have a corresponding adjustment with Ghana as an example. So our platform company has been able to go and do a project to restore degraded land in Ghana that is actually going to come into the corresponding adjustment. And because the way the Singapore carbon pricing works, basically it continues to go up where it becomes 50 to 80 Sing dollars by 2030. Almost all of the economy is actually covered by it for carbon intense sectors. So it's actually quite significant in the context of Singapore. And 5% of that can be used for corresponding adjustment, right? So those are some of the things that you can actually demonstrate by advocating, informing as to what some of the unlocks are, and then tangible proof points are, and how do you actually invest into these projects in a sustainable way that creates value financially, but for the environment, both on climate as well as on nature, and for the community.
Thank you. They're excellent examples, and thanks for dealing with the data part. So, Amy, do you mind if I direct you in a slightly different way?
No problem.
If that's okay, just to pick up one of the other questions. And I think this is right for you, but tell me if not. What are the top 1 or 2 arguments that can be made to boards and executive management teams in terms of convincing them to put biodiversity on the agenda?
Yeah.
Is that a fair question?
That is a fair question. And it's a question we have had a lot. We've been engaging on biodiversity for a very long time, including with PRI through palm oil roundtables and whatnot. But I think it's a new way of thinking about it at the moment. And we ask these questions where we've identified that biodiversity risk is something that we feel that boards should be considering. We've been looking at the 5 drivers of biodiversity loss. And I think sometimes we've had quite blank stares from the people across the table. I do think over time, though, it has improved in terms of reception. And certainly what we've seen maybe over the last couple of years is that most boards now have had 1 full day of biodiversity training. So I think that so long as that training is good, and I think the investors are going in and saying, like, we see this as material. And I think the way that you can look at the materiality is through those 5 drivers of biodiversity loss, so climate change, pollution, the big one, which is the change in land and sea use, invasive alien species, and direct exploitation of organisms. You need to then explain all of those things and why it might be important to the particular company and the impact on the business and operations. But you also need to look at the risks. And so we will also explain the transition risks, the climate, the physical risks, regulatory risk, reputational risk, and the systemic risk. And it does take some explaining. And this is why most boards now have had 1 full day. We hope that there's going to be more that happens. But I think certainly there are real opportunities to, I think boards are now open. It's not something that seems kind of off the mark, but we need to see it happen much faster and more action on the ambitions.
Okay, thank you. All right, so this next question is for anyone who's feeling brave. What's the role of fossil fuel producers at COP? Should they be let in? Should they be part of the process, or should they be left removed? Any takers?
I'll
Quick response on this one.
I'll give it a go, and I think It's not so much. I think what we need to do is start calling out fossil fuel producers, because we're in there are, I think, my counting, there are 3 great lies that fossil fuel companies have published. One is that nothing's happening on climate change and they've ignored all their own science. The second is that it's all actually our fault and the individual carbon footprint. And I think we're now in the 3rd great lie, which is that they can easily transition to just be energy companies. They're not fossil fuel companies, they're energy companies. And that's where we're at right now. That to me feels like it's a bit of a lie, on the basis that changing from a business model of fossil fuel production to a business model of being fully renewable energy production, whilst maintaining shareholder value with the balance sheet that you would have as a fossil fuel company, is very, very hard. And it's not clear to me that that's very practical or possible.
Right, so not bring them into the process because they can't necessarily change their business model. So that's a very clear view, if you don't mind me saying. Does anybody want to take a counter view on this one? Go on.
Just to be provocative, maybe I'll take a counter view, which is, I mean, sorry, every time I look at the screen, collaboration keeps coming up.
We don't time the slides for the individual speaker, don't worry.
But look, I mean, I come back to the point that this requires the entire economy to transition.
Yep.
And I saw some of the data coming, I think it was from LSC, if I remember correctly, but it showed that the overall economy right now, less than 10% is actually green. The rest of it is our legacy fossil-based system, right? So if you don't get them in the room and hear from investors or other stakeholders on why it's important for them to transition, right? You're going to have the same systems issue. And, you know, in some ways, also, I've heard the word tyranny of the target, where when investors set targets or companies set targets, it's a lot easier just to meet that target by divesting out of things, but it does nothing for the real economy. So I do think we need to collaborate, but we need to have accountability in that collaboration. We need to hold them accountable for the things that they're going to say they're going to be doing. And also, particularly for those who are long-term investors in the room, make it very clear why it truly matters. Maybe short term, if there's unfortunate disruptions geopolitically, energy prices may rise and therefore you can actually do more outsized dividends or stock repurchases. But that is a short-term financial engineering. If you want a resilient portfolio that's around for the long term, these companies have to be resilient for the long term, right? And the structural tailwinds are incredibly clear, right? And, you know, we internalize the carbon externality because we believe that in some form or fashion, carbon pricing is inevitable, right? Whether it comes in directly or indirectly. So we use $65 for all of our new investments. That's going to go up to $100 by 2030. No one's telling us to do it, but it's about a resilient portfolio that makes sure that you are thinking through what does it mean as an investor from a risk and return perspective, and doing well, but importantly, doing good and doing the right thing.
Yeah. Good. Okay, the price of entry for a fossil fuel company to COP is knowing what their internal carbon price is.
And accountability.
And accountability. All right, so we need to finish in a moment. Go on.
Quickly on the accountability, I don't think I need to explain where I stand on this, but a just transition is very important to have as a conversation from the policy side and also with the sector. And also for us to think a step ahead. We're talking about how sensitive and how critical the energy transition is and the fossil fuel industry. But how about if I just challenge you and flip the question? What if we are talking about biodiversity and nature and talking about agriculture and talking about food security?
Sure.
How that narrative would completely change. So what are the asks are very important to be on the table.
Yeah, that's a well made point. All right, we can see the timing. We're just about to come to the end. So if you could just answer very quickly, if you had one ask for the investment community and one ask for the governments leading up to these COPs, what would they be? Anyone who's ready?
I think from my perspective, I think it's just be active owners in whatever way that you want to be. Get out there, steward your assets, do it yourself, use others, be aligned. But there's so much opportunity. So I think that would be the one thing I would ask there. I think with the governments, I suspect this is what everyone is going to say, but we need the alignment of financial flows. We need to get the balance sheet right and we need to get it all moving in the right direction. Otherwise, we're running to standstill or just going backwards, quite frankly.
Thank you. Excellent. Additions? Or shall we upvote those?
I mean, I guess if I had to just pick one, I would say let's have an ownership mindset as investors, right? We own this, both the risk and the opportunity. And if we really feel that we really own this, then we'll take the right actions, whether it's engagement, whether it's how we allocate our capital, whether it's policy, and so forth. For policymakers, that's a tough one, but I guess where I will leave it is provide the right pricing signals, whether it's the subsidies reform, whether it's in the context of pricing for things, whether it's in the context of providing the right frameworks, etc. Because ultimately, finance is like water. It goes to where the lowest risks are and the highest returns are. And so we just got to figure out how to bring systems change to enable that flow to go to the right places.
Thank you. James?
Yeah, very, very, very similar answers. It's about understanding. Governments need to understand how capital flows, and exactly as you say, it flows like water. It flows to the easiest place. How do you make the easiest place the place that we all want it to be? And then you can work with us to understand that. So engage with us. We should engage with back. We should showcase our expertise in terms of how capital flows. Governments need to talk to us about the actions that they can take. And we can then share ideas on, well, would that actually have the effect of moving capital in the way we want to see it?
Very good. Layla, you want to jump in?
Quickly, I think everything was covered, but one learning from climate COPs and progress, we don't have time. We can't wait for data to be perfect or for policymakers to get it very right. We have to jump in. So time.
Thank you. All right. Please all thank our panelists, and thanks to you for your time this morning.